This is a skull ring. Ask 10 people what it means, and you'll get 10 different answers. A 16th century physician would call it a warning against vanity. A fighter pilot would call it defiance. A writer would call it brotherhood. Underneath all of those answers sits one idea, a promise, in Latin, Memento Mori. Remember that you will die. And that was never a threat. For 500 years, it's been the opposite, an instruction to live. Begin in ancient Rome. Writers describe a victory parade, a general in a golden chariot, a whole city shouting his name. And behind him, the story goes, stood a slave with a single job, to lean in and whisper, "Look behind you. Remember, you are only a man." The Christian writer Tertullian recorded that whisper around the year 200. Historians still argue over how often it truly happened, but Rome wrote the idea down, and Europe never forgot it. Then came the 14th century, and the idea stopped being philosophy. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed roughly 1 in every 3 Europeans. Death was no longer an abstraction. It lived on every street. Art absorbed the shock. In 1424, on a cemetery wall in Paris, painters set out a scene Europe would copy for centuries. The Danse Macabre, the dance of death. Grinning skeletons leading a pope, an emperor, a child, a laborer. Everyone dancing to the same grave. The message was brutal and strangely democratic. Death takes everyone, in any order it likes. That Paris mural is long lost. The idea it painted never was. Europe had learned to look death in the face. The next step was to wear it. By the 1500s, in England and across the continent, goldsmiths were carving tiny skulls into rings. They were called Memento Mori rings, and they were not gloomy trinkets. They were instruments, philosophy you could carry. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London still keeps them. One in black enamel and gold carries the inscription, "Behold the end." Another reads, "Noce te ipsum," know yourself. And in plain English on the same hoop, die to live. Die to live. Sit with that inversion for a second. The skull wasn't there to darken your day. It was there to sharpen it. These rings were common enough that Shakespeare used them as a punchline. In Love's Labour's Lost, a thin, gaunt face gets mocked as a death's face in a ring. And Falstaff grumbles that a friend's face haunts him as a death's head, or a memento mori. The audience laughed because half of them owned one. Picture a London merchant in 1590. Plague seasons come and go with the shipping. Before he signs anything, his eye finds the small silver skull on his finger, not out of fear, out of focus. Then the ring learned a second job, grief. On the 30th of January, 1649, King Charles I of England was beheaded. His followers commissioned quiet rings of rock crystal over woven hair and golden ciphers to mourn a king they were not allowed to A style was born. For the next 100 years, mourning rings carried enameled skulls, tiny coffins, and the names and death dates of the people they stood for. The Great Plague of 1665 made them a custom of the age. People left money in their wills so their friends could wear their memory. Wear one, and you weren't carrying a symbol anymore. You were carrying a person. But fashions soften. By Queen Victoria's century, mourning jewelry turned sentimental. Jet black stones, locks of hair, willows and urns. The stark old skull slowly went quiet in the parlor. It didn't disappear. It changed address, from the drawing room to the battlefield. Prussia, 1741. Frederick the Great raises Hussar Regiment No. 5, black uniforms, and on every cap, a silver death's head. The Totenkopf. The meaning had flipped. This skull didn't whisper, "Remember, you will die." It announced, "We have already made our peace with dying." Britain answered. In 1759, after General Wolfe fell at Quebec, a new cavalry regiment took the skull and crossbones for its badge, over 2 words, or glory. Death or glory. For nearly 2 centuries, the Death's Head rode with cavalry across Europe. Same skull. Entirely new sentence. It has a dark chapter, and it matters to say it plainly. In the Second World War, the Totenkopf was worn by Hitler's SS. That stain is real. But the skull is centuries older than that abuse, and it outlived it. Because on the other side of that same war, the skull was grinning from Allied aircraft. American crews painted laughing skulls on bomber noses and stitched them onto jackets. Young men flying into flak at 20,000 feet. The skull was how they told the odds they weren't blinking. In 1945, those men came home, and some of them found peacetime quiet. Too quiet. They bought surplus motorcycles, and they found each other. Riding clubs with names like the Boozefighters in 1946. And in Fontana, California, in March 1948, the Hells Angels. Their famous winged death's head was drawn from the same Air Corps squadron patches those veterans had worn over Europe. The skull had ridden bombers. Now it rode Harleys. On the 4th of July weekend, 1947, 4,000 riders overwhelmed the little town of Hollister, California. The headlines invented the outlaw biker, and the skull became his coat of arms. For riders, the old Latin promise still held, just stripped of Latin. Riding fast is dangerous. We ride anyway. A skull ring on a rider's fist said all of that without one word. And it added something the philosophers never had: brotherhood. Wear the same skull, live by the same code. Then, in 1978, the skull ring walked on stage. 2 London jewelers, David Quartz and Bill Hackett, made a silver skull ring for one of the most famous guitarists alive. He put it on, and as far as anyone can tell, never really took it off. Decades of stages, interviews, album covers. That ring is in every frame. And the skull ring stopped belonging to any one tribe. It was bikers and rock stars, and anyone who wanted the world to know they kept their own rules. By the time it reached fashion houses and runways, the skull had done something almost no symbol manages. 5 centuries of continuous meaning, and still climbing. So, what does a skull ring mean today? Honestly, it depends whose hand it's on. 4 readings dominate. 1. Mortality awareness. The original meaning. For people who've lost someone or survived something, the skull is a daily reminder that time is finite. Not dark. Grounding. 2. Rebellion. The biker and punk inheritance. A quiet signal that you stand outside the mainstream by choice. 3. Brotherhood. In club culture, the skull marks belonging, loyalty made visible. And 4. Pure design. Plenty of people wear one simply because it's a beautiful object. Carved shadow, bone-white highlights, real weight in the hand. Look closer, and the skull's expression changes the message. A stoic, closed-jaw skull is the classic Memento Mori. Calm acceptance. A wide, gaping jaw skull is defiance, a warning label with a jawbone. A grinning skull is dark humor. Death is absurd, so laugh at it. Every pirate flag understood that one. A sugar skull celebrates the dead. The Day of the Dead tradition of honoring loved ones without fear. And a crowned skull says power ends, or that death itself is king. Both readings are 500 years old. Even direction matters. Skull facing you, a private reminder. Skull facing out, a statement to everyone else. Most riders wear it facing out. And there's a reason none of this ever goes out of style. Your brain is wired for faces. A region called the fusiform face area fires in under 1/5 of a second when it sees 2 sockets, a nasal cavity, and a jaw, even when it knows the face is carved from silver. A skull ring gets noticed the way a plain silver band never will. That isn't marketing. That's neurology. Psychology adds one more thing. Gentle reminders of mortality can nudge people toward generosity, toward being present. The old philosophers were onto something measurable. 500 years, a physician's warning, a widow's memory, a hussar's dare, an airman's grin, a rider's code. One small silver object carried all of it, and never once meant the same thing to any 2 hands. So when you put one on, you're not copying anyone. You're joining an argument about living and dying that's been running since the plague years, and adding your own answer. Memento Mori. Remember you will die, and live like you know it.